Okay, so you're here and you're trying to stay ahead of the game, right?
Yeah.
In the defense world, and we're breaking down a very specific thing, a recommendation from something called the Forged Act.
Right.
And we're going to laser focus on Section 308,
Okay.
which is all about commercial solutions openings.
Mm-hmm.
CSOs. Now, in a nutshell, think of CSOs as the Department of Defense saying, hey, we want your innovative commercial technology, and we want it quickly. So this is going to be especially interesting for you if you're in that defense space, working with the DoD, or if you have a company that has some really cutting-edge tech that you think could have military applications.
Absolutely, yeah. This is not your average, everyday government contracting. CSOs are really designed for speed and for tapping into the dynamism of the commercial sector. And Section 308 is really trying to amplify that, make it even more efficient, even more streamlined.
So our mission today is pretty simple. We're going to unpack this Section 308 recommendation. We're going to understand what these changes actually mean in practice. We're going to look at the potential impact of this and give you some actionable insights on how to prepare, how to implement these new guidelines. So without further ado, let's dive right in. What exactly does this Section 308 entail, and why is it something that, our listeners should be paying attention to?
So at its core, Section 308 is introducing some very pivotal changes to the way that CSOs operate. And this is specifically by amending 10 U.S.C. Section 3458. There are three core changes that we really want to highlight. The first one is it now permits sole source follow-on contracts. So imagine this, DoD finds a commercial solution they love through a CSO.
Right.
This change means they can potentially just go directly to that company for future work without having to go through another big competitive bid, which, as you know, is huge.
That seems like it would really streamline things.
Absolutely. It cuts out so much time and energy.
Oh, yeah. So if you're a company out there listening, you have a really promising solution. Getting that initial win could really set you up, to a much clearer path to more business with the DoD.
Couldn't agree more. And that leads right into the second big change, which is all about decentralizing the approval authority for CSOs.
Okay.
So this power is being pushed down to the heads of contracting activities. It's like they're cutting out layers of bureaucracy, trying to speed up those decisions, get things moving faster, from identifying the need to actually awarding that contract.
Yeah, fewer approval layers certainly seems like a good thing for speed and agility.
Exactly. And then the third change, it's a pretty big one too, is a new requirement for open solicitations that are specifically targeted at what they call non-traditional defense contractors, or NDCs.
NDCs, got it.
So these are companies that don't typically do a lot of business with the DoD. Maybe they're in a completely different sector. They've never really thought about defense applications for their work.
Right.
The goal here is to really broaden the pool of innovators that the DoD can tap into.
I mean, that's got to be a good thing, right? Bringing in fresh perspectives, new ideas.
It's all about casting a wider net and seeing what's out there.
Okay, so these CSOs, they're not brand new, right? There's a history here. So what led to these specific changes in Section 308? Like, why now?
You're absolutely right. CSOs, they didn't just appear out of thin air.
Right.
The concept was formally introduced back in 2017, but it was really building on much earlier efforts going all the way back to 1994 to simplify how the DoD buys things. There was this growing recognition, and we've seen reports from the GAO, from chrisreports.congress.gov, highlighting this, that the traditional way the DoD does procurement, it's slow, it's cumbersome, it often struggles to keep up with the rapid pace of tech development, especially in the commercial world.
So the DoD was getting left behind a bit.
In a way, yeah. And groups like the Defense Science Board and you can see some of their work on innovation.defense.gov. They've been pushing for more flexible approaches to engaging with companies out there, especially those outside that traditional defense industrial base.
So CSOs were kind of the first attempt to bridge that gap, but they weren't perfect, right?
Yeah, exactly. We can see some of the initial feedback, from platforms like Discover.Gedic.mil, and the early experience with CSOs. It showed there were definitely limitations. The rules around follow-on contracts, for example, were really restrictive, and that approval process, getting sign-off from high-level officials, well, it could still take forever.
So it's still a lot of bureaucratic hurdles.
Right, and so Section 308, this part of the Forged Act that came out in late 2024, it's really a deliberate attempt to refine that framework, learn from those early experiences and make CSOs a more effective tool for accessing all that commercial innovation that's out there.
So they're trying to get it right this time.
Yeah, they're really doubling down on this idea.
Okay, so we've talked about what Now let's talk about the why. What are the desired outcomes here? What are these changes in Section 308 supposed to achieve?
Okay, so the legislation, it lays out 5 main goals or desired effects. And the first one is all about speed,
Hmm.
right? So by making it easier to award those sole source follow-on contracts, the idea is that it'll speed up the delivery of new capabilities to the people who actually need them, the warfighters.
So getting the tech into the hands of the people on the ground faster.
Precisely because if that initial CSO is successful, it should be much easier to scale up that solution without having to go through a whole new competition, which, as you know, can take months or even years.
Yeah, time is of the essence.
Absolutely. And this really recognizes that in today's world, technology evolves so quickly that if you're stuck in those traditional timelines, even a cutting-edge solution might be obsolete by the time you actually get it fielded.
So speed and relevance are key.
Yeah, they go hand in hand. Okay, so the second goal here, it's all about reducing bureaucracy, getting rid of those unnecessary hurdles. So by pushing that approval authority down to those heads of contracting activities, the hope is that the process will just become much faster, more responsive.
So less red tape.
Yeah, exactly. And then the third goal, this is where those NDCs come in. Remember those non-traditional defense contractors? So by specifically requiring open CSOs that target these companies, the DoD is really trying to diversify its innovation pipeline, right? Bring in new ideas, new approaches, things that they might not see from the traditional defense companies.
So they're really trying to expand that network of innovators.
It's about thinking outside the box and looking beyond the usual suspects.
Okay, so we've got speed, we've got less bureaucracy, and we've got new players. What else are they aiming for?
Right. So the fourth goal, it's about aligning CSOs more closely with this idea of agile acquisition. And agile, it's more than just being fast. It's a way of working. It's a mindset where you have these constant feedback loops and you can adjust the requirements as you go and incorporate new developments much more quickly than you can with these traditional long-term contracts.
So it's iterative, it's flexible.
Exactly. And then finally, the fifth goal, it's really about accelerating the transition of those mature commercial technologies from that initial prototype stage to actually being deployed in the field. So the goal is to really leverage all those existing commercial advances to meet the needs of the DoD much faster.
So basically taking something that's already proven and adapting it for military use.
Yeah, it's about capitalizing on what's already out there.
Okay. All of these sound like really positive changes, but
Yeah.
Anytime you make big shifts like this, there's got to be potential downsides, things to watch out for. So what are some of the potential negative consequences that we should be thinking about?
You're absolutely right. While these changes are intended to be positive, there are always trade-offs and
Yes.
and there are some potential downsides that we need to consider.
Okay, let's hear them.
So the first one, and this is a big one, is that by allowing these sole source follow-on contracts while it speeds things up, it does reduce competition. And over time, that could lead to, higher costs for the DoD. It could create this perception of favoritism towards certain companies if it's not managed really carefully.
Right. So
Okay.
making sure that one company doesn't have an unfair advantage and that the DoD is still getting a good deal.
Exactly. Value for money is crucial. And then the second potential downside, it's this risk of inconsistency, because remember that approval authority, it's being pushed down to all these different contracting activities.
Right.
Well, different contracting heads, they might interpret the rules differently. They might implement them differently. And that could lead to a real lack of uniformity across the department.
So a company might have a very different experience depending on who they're working with.
Exactly. And that can be really frustrating and confusing for everyone involved.
Yeah, consistency is so important, both for the folks inside the DoD and for those companies trying to navigate the system.
Couldn't agree more. And then the third concern, it's this idea that while the focus on non-traditional defense contractors is meant to be inclusive, bring in new players, it could inadvertently make those traditional defense contractors feel like they're being pushed out.
Like they're being left behind.
Yeah, exactly. And those traditional companies, they have a lot of expertise. They've established relationships with the DoD and those are valuable. So it's about finding the right balance, making sure everyone has a seat at the table.
So not alienating the old guard while welcoming the new.
Exactly. And then the fourth potential downside, it's this worry that in all this rush to be agile, to be fast, we might sacrifice quality. So if those agile acquisition processes aren't managed really carefully, There's a risk that the quality assurance processes might not be as rigorous as they should be, and that could lead to, systems being fielded that haven't been properly vetted.
And that could have serious consequences.
Absolutely. Safety, reliability, those can't be compromised just for the sake of speed.
Yeah, speed can't come at the expense of everything else.
And then finally, the fifth concern, it's about the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
With more and more CSOs happening and that authority being delegated, it's going to put a huge strain on the folks who are actually responsible for managing all of this.
So they might be overwhelmed.
Exactly. And if they don't have enough resources, if they're not properly trained, that could lead to mistakes. It could lead to insufficient oversight.
So potentially a lot of unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's something to be very mindful of.
So it sounds like the DoD is aware of these potential pitfalls. So what are they doing to try to mitigate these risks?
Well, the good news is that the analysis, it does outline some specific mitigation strategies that the DoD is planning to implement. So to address those competition concerns around sole source follow-on contracts, the plan is to have these regular and really rigorous reviews of all those contracts just to make sure that they're still the best deal for the DoD.
So making sure they're not getting taken advantage of.
Exactly, keeping those companies honest. And then to try and ensure consistency, with all those different contracting activities, making decisions, the plan is to develop and really clearly communicate these standardized guidelines and best practices for how all those heads of contracting activities should be managing those CSO approvals.
Okay, so trying to get everyone on the same page.
Exactly, a unified approach. And as for those traditional defense contractors, the ones who might be feeling a little left out, the strategy is to make sure that they still have opportunities to compete through other acquisition pathways.
Okay, so maybe not all CSOs are targeted at NDCs. There are other ways for those traditional companies to get involved?
Exactly. It's about maintaining a level playing field and then to address those quality concerns with agile acquisition. The DoD is going to mandate these minimum quality checks and standards that absolutely have to be met, even with the faster timelines.
So kind of like a non-negotiable baseline for
Exactly. You can't cut corners on safety and reliability. And then finally, to help those poor folks who are going to be managing all of this, the plan is to really invest in increasing the staffing levels and providing much better training programs for everyone who's involved in CSO management and oversight.
So giving them the support and the resources that they need to be successful?
Exactly. Because if they're not set up for success, the whole thing could fall apart.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the people within the DoD who are going to be most affected by these changes. Who needs to be paying extra close attention to all of this?
Okay, so there are a few key roles that are really going to be in the thick of it. The heads of contracting activities, their authority and their responsibilities related to CSOs are going to expand significantly. They're going to have to be making more strategic decisions, really managing these processes effectively.
So a lot more on their plate.
Absolutely. And then the contracting officers, they're going to be the ones on the front lines, right? They're going to be managing a much higher volume of CSOs. They're going to need to develop the expertise to work with these non-traditional defense contractors and really understand those agile acquisition methodologies.
So a whole new skill set that they're going to have to master.
Exactly. It's a steep learning curve for some. And then you have the portfolio acquisition executives and the system command staff, the folks who are responsible for overseeing those broader acquisition strategies and making sure all those technologies are being integrated into the existing military systems.
So making sure everything works together.
Exactly. And they're going to have a much bigger oversight role. They're going to need to be coordinating across all these different initiatives. So it's a lot more complex.
That sounds like a lot of moving pieces.
Absolutely. And it's not just folks inside the DoD who are going to be affected, right? What about those stakeholders outside the department? Are there groups who might have some concerns or some reservations about these changes?
Yeah, I'm sure there are people who aren't thrilled about this.
Oh, absolutely. You can bet that those traditional defense contractors, they're going to be watching this very closely and they're probably going to be a little apprehensive about, potentially losing out on opportunities if the focus shifts too much towards these non-traditional entrants.
Right, they've been the main players for so long, it's got to be a little unsettling.
And then you have the congressional oversight bodies. They're going to want to make sure that competition is still happening, that taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly. That they have a duty to ensure accountability and oversight. So they're going to be asking a lot of questions.
So they'll be keeping a close eye on things.
Oh yeah, and then you also have the DoD auditors. They're going to have concerns about all this flexibility around sole source contracts. Making sure that everything is still above board and transparent.
So maintaining accountability is going to be really important.
Absolutely. You can't just throw the rule book out the window.
So for our listeners out there, whether you're working within the DoD or you're a company that's looking to partner with the DoD, what are some practical things that you can do to prepare for these Section 308 changes?
Well, the analysis, it highlights a few key areas for preparation. And the first one is that the DoD is going to need to invest in what they're calling CSO management tools. So if you're involved in acquisition or contracting within the DoD, you really need to understand what those tools are, how they're going to work, how they're going to fit in with the existing systems, be proactive about learning about those new technologies.
So if you're tech savvy, this is your time to shine.
Exactly. And for commercial partners, you should try to understand the types of digital platforms that the DoD is going to be using for CSO solicitations for management that could give you a real leg up.
So do your research figure out how the DoD is operating online?
And then the second thing, because there's this big emphasis on agile acquisition and working with non-traditional defense contractors, DoD personnel, you really need to prioritize training in these areas.
So brushing up on your agile skills.
Yeah, exactly. And for companies, familiarize yourself with those agile principles, tailor your approach to the specific needs of the defense sector.
So it's not just about having a great product. It's about knowing how to work with the DoD.
Exactly. And then finally, with all this increased CSO activity, all this oversight, there's going to be a need for more people to manage all of this. So if you're looking for a job within the DoD's acquisition and contracting workforce, now's a good time to start thinking about those evolving skill sets.
So potential career opportunity for those who are interested.
Absolutely. There's going to be a demand for people who can navigate this new landscape. So it's worth exploring those options.
Okay, so let's say all these changes are implemented. How will the DoD know if they're actually working? What are the metrics for success here?
So the analysis, it actually lays out some specific metrics that the DoD is likely to track. And the first one is pretty straightforward. They're going to be looking for a 20% reduction in the average time it takes to award contracts using CSOs.
Okay, so a clear measure of efficiency.
Yeah, they want to see things moving faster. And then another key metric is going to be a 25% increase in the participation rate of those non-traditional defense contractors, the NDCs and CSO solicitations.
Yeah. So are they actually bringing in those new players?
Exactly. That's what they want to see. And then finally, they're also going to be looking at whether those new capabilities are actually being fielded 30% faster. Because ultimately it's about getting that technology into the hands of the people who need it quickly.
So not just awarding the contract, but actually getting those solutions out into the field.
Exactly. It's about the real world impact. And those are the benchmarks that they're going to be using to evaluate whether Section 308 is really making a difference.
Okay, so those are some pretty concrete goals. Now, were there any other ideas out there, other ways to achieve these same objectives?
So the analysis, it does mention a couple of alternative ideas that were considered. One was, the possibility of just making the existing other transaction authorities or OTAs even more flexible. So OTAs, they're already a way for the DoD to work with non-traditional partners outside of those traditional contracting regulations. But the idea was maybe we could just tweak those a little bit, make them even more user-friendly.
It's kind of evolution of the existing system.
Exactly. And then another idea, and you can actually find more about this on innovation.defense.gov, was to maybe do a smaller pilot program first, test out these CSO changes on a smaller scale before rolling them out to the entire department.
So a more cautious approach?
Exactly. Kind of dip your toes in the water first, see how it goes before you jump in head first.
Okay, so a lot of different options on the table. So let's bring it all together, for our listeners who are trying to wrap their heads around all of this. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into Section 308?
So I think the main takeaway is that this Section 308, it really signals a shift in the way that the DoD is thinking about acquisition. They're serious about speeding up the process, about being more agile, about really tapping into that vast pool of commercial innovation that's out there, and that's exciting. It has the potential to really transform the way that the DoD gets the technologies that it needs to stay ahead of the curve. But it's not going to be easy.
Right.
There are challenges, there are potential downsides that need to be carefully managed, and it's going to require a lot of effort from everyone involved to make it work.
So a lot of potential, but also a lot of work to do.
Yeah, exactly. And for those of you in the commercial sector, this is a real opportunity to get involved with the DoD to bring your innovative solutions to the table. But you have to understand the rules of the game. You have to adapt your strategies and really be prepared to work within this new framework.
So do your homework be proactive?
Exactly. And don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions.
Yeah.
The DoD, they want to partner with you. They need your expertise. So don't be shy.
Great advice. So to recap Section 308, it's all about making those CSOs faster, more efficient, more focused on bringing in new ideas and new players. And it's a pretty big change for the DoD. It's an evolution in how they do business, and it's something that everyone needs to be aware of.
Absolutely. This deep dive into this specific recommendation from the Forged Act, hopefully it's given you a good foundation, a good understanding of what's coming down the pike and some insights into how to prepare, how to navigate this new landscape.
So what innovative solutions out there might now have a more direct and rapid pathway to supporting the DoD, and what can you do right now to position yourself to contribute to this evolving world of defense acquisition? Those are the questions that I want you to walk away with today. So thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a great conversation.
My pleasure.